It's live streaming.
And admitting the folks to the room. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Folks are filing into the virtual room here. Hopefully everybody is arriving at the Scientist Rebellion Buen Vivir talk. We'll just wait another few seconds to let everybody in the room, and then we'll get started. Great. I think we have a quorum here. Well, welcome everybody to this month's edition of Buen Vivir, which is the speaker series organized by Scientist Rebellion, Turtle Island, to help us understand how to live bigger, better, not bigger. Each month we feature an expert speaker featuring topics related to realizing a well-being economy, to examining and refining the concept of degrowth, and to developing an understanding of what is a good life in a time of global upheaval. Our speakers explore topics at the intersections of social, nature, and economic justice, building societies where fairness, equality, and livable standards are balanced with land and resource rights, environmental protections, and dignity for all. The talks are live streamed on our social media platforms, and past episodes can be found on our website. Today's speaker, Dana R. Fisher, Ph.D. Dr. Fisher is the director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, and is a professor at the School of International Service at American University. CECE is developing a long-term vision and an audacious roadmap for meeting the environmental challenges that lie ahead here in Turtle Island and throughout the global community. Dr. Fisher's latest book is Saving Ourselves: From Climate Shocks to Climate Action, just published last year. And today, Dr. Fisher will be sharing insights on saving ourselves in a polycrisis. So please, Dana, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me on this. Today is Wednesday, right? On this Wednesday. I'm going to just start sharing my screen. And what I put together today is an updated version of the findings from my book to talk through how we can learn from the book, from Saving Ourselves. There's a copy of it. It's over here too. And then also think about how that relates to what's going on in the world today, which we'll think about, but hopefully not in a scary way. So I am going to just turn on my slides. I'm going to try again to turn on my slides.
They're loading.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. So you can see them though, right, Greg? I see you. Okay, cool. All right, so today what I'm going to talk about is thinking about saving ourselves in a polycrisis. So just for everybody, so we're on the same page. What's a polycrisis? Well, a polycrisis is actually a terminology that's come from my colleagues over in ecology, but it actually applies very nicely to the world that we're living in right now. Here's just a definition that comes from the World Economic Forum from 2023. It's a cluster of related global risks with compounding effects such that the overall impact exceeds the sum of each part. So what we're living through right now is absolutely a polycrisis, and I just have some images of reasons why we're in a polycrisis, including the occupation of numerous cities, including my city of Washington, D.C., and a government that shuts down right now, but is also employing overreach to basically implement autocracy. And then we also are experiencing, as you all know, a climate crisis. So within that context, I've been thinking a lot about the findings and the work that I've done around climate change and how we respond to the climate crisis effectively, to think about it today. So just a kind of a couple of top line findings from Saving Ourselves. If you're interested in this, though, you may want to check it out, the book. So the basic premise of the book is, it's bad, it's getting worse, and nothing we've done thus far is enough to stop the climate crisis. And I just would say, we are moving into the period of the year where everybody talks about the upcoming climate negotiations. COP30 is going to be taking place in Brazil in a couple of weeks. And right before that, the UN and all these other international organizations release their reports. And for anybody who can still bear to watch the news, you may have noticed that it's just terrible news all around. And then we have, the largest hurricane ever to hit the Caribbean, just, decimated Jamaica, and I believe right now is on its way, if it hasn't already hit Cuba. So the climate crisis is upon us. Now, I'm a social scientist. I'm actually a sociologist by training. So my part of this climate story is that I think about the social consequences and the social components of the climate crisis. So one of the things that we know from a lot of research, including mine, is that climate shocks are becoming more severe, they're hitting more frequently, and they are having social consequences. So they are going to lead to social conflict as areas become uninhabitable, resources become scarcer, which can lead to conflict related to resource scarcity. And also climate migration is going to become more common. We're already seeing the beginning of that. And as you all may have noticed, our country doesn't handle migration particularly well, but a lot of countries do not. We're not alone in that, although we may be doing the worst job of any country at the moment, but we're not alone in the challenges of climate migration. So given that situation, we are in for not just a warming world, but a world that has a lot more conflict and crisis. So then how do we get ourselves out of this? And, in saving ourselves, what I do is I review the different ways that we know that these types of crises can be resolved. And one of them is thinking about the state. The government can actually take over and could resolve the problem, or the economy, which we call the market, could. But unfortunately, after 25 years of doing this work, it's very clear to me that the state and the market won't save us. And, as I talk about in the book, the status quo is being maintained by the consolidation of power among entrenched interests, which are particularly including those who are connected to fossil fuel interests. And the only way to address the climate crisis effectively is with systemic changes that are needed. And because of the ways that business and government actors are really connected and basically, captured by fossil fuel interests at this point, social change is most likely to come from civil society. And I just would say, civil society includes all of us here as everyday citizens, as individuals, but civil society also includes collectives like organizations, including, Scientist Rebellion, and also all sorts of advocacy groups, mutual aid groups, et cetera, and so forth, community groups. So civil society has the capacity to lead, but it's not there yet. And that's kind of what I do at the end of Saving Ourselves is I talk about how we could actually get to the mass mobilization that's needed to address the climate crisis. And I talk about this within the context of what I call apocalyptic optimism. And so I should just say, I call myself an apocalyptic optimist. If anybody's interested in understanding that part, there's a TED Talk about it that I did a year ago this week, which is basically explaining why I'm an apocalyptic optimist. But being an apocalyptic optimist basically means that I am hopeful that we can address the climate crisis, but I also know that we need to be realistic about the path we're on. Because first of all, if we're not realistic, too many people will be caught off guard, and too many people will be open to misinformation because they do not realize the crisis that we're already in. So in the book, I talk about how anthro shifts can actually involve empowering civil society to lead to better environmental outcomes. And I would just say anthro shifts are just this kind of very theoretical term that I use to talk about the way the world can change when we are confronted with high levels of risk. And obviously, climate change leads us to risk, but also autocracy leads us to all feel risk. I mean, I don't know how many of you live in cities that are occupied or know people who are under threats from ICE, but these are all risks that we all feel, and it actually drives people to make decisions and can actually lead to, there being more opportunities for citizens in some cases. And I talk about this in the book. So one of the things that I talk about in the book as well is that, my theory of change actually runs through climate shocks and through the personal experiences of the climate crisis. So what I mean by this is that I believe that for us to mobilize the masses and get us to the type of mobilization that's necessary for civil society to be able to push back against power, we are going to need to have more people experiencing the climate crisis firsthand. What we know about this is that when people do experience the climate crisis firsthand, They are more likely to support climate action and climate policy, and they tend to be more engaged in climate work. And I cite here, there are a couple of new studies that just came out. I was involved in a National Academy of Sciences panel on this last spring, but there is even a recent paper that just came out about this. But time and time again, studies are showing that the people who experience climate exacerbated disaster tend to be much more concerned about the climate crisis, tend to be more open to and supportive of climate science, and even do more climate engaged work. And so these are just a couple of articles about this. But what we also know is that when people experience the climate crisis firsthand, if they are not prepared and aware of the science of climate change and how climate change works, they're opened up to misinformation. And we saw that after Hurricane Helene last year, we saw that after the wildfires in California. And so misinformation can dilute the effects of this process. And it's something that actually I'm starting to study in my work now, because I think it's a really important component of understanding how we can actually mobilize the masses and what it will take to get people out in the streets pushing back like it's necessary. So that's kind of the argument that I make in the book. But I figured since we're here in 2025, I would talk a little bit about the work that I do around protest and activism. And because that's part of the Polycrisis, I thought it would be helpful here. And just to say, the book that I wrote before Saving Ourselves is called American Resistance, From the Women's March to the Blue Wave, which I wrote during the first Trump administration. And since we're dealing with a second Trump administration, I've been out in the streets collecting data once again. So I thought I would share a little bit of what I learned. So here's what I've got. So one of the things that I do is I survey protesters. That's one of the ways that I collect data to answer the kinds of research questions I have. So I've been out in the streets with a team collecting data at all the large-scale protests that we've seen so far this year. I also have here a column that you can see from Women's March 2017, just so we can compare. So these are a couple pictures I've taken. This is a little collage I made from No Kings 2. Was that 2 weekends ago now? But what we can basically see is that the demographics of Resistance 2.0 are in a lot of ways very similar to the first round of resistance to the Trump administration and its policies. People out in the streets tend to be more female than male. They tend to be predominantly white. They are highly educated, left-leaning, and voted Democrat. I mean, they voted for Harris. Actually, it's a Women's March 2017. They actually voted for Clinton, not Harris. So excuse that mistake on my slides. Some of the other things that we collect data about from people in the streets is we look at what people are doing, because, you know, one of the things that people say is, why are people out in the streets marching? And I can talk a lot about that if people want to understand why people participate in demonstrations and protests. But what we actually want to know is what else people are doing. And that's one of the things that I talk about in American Resistance. But here are data from this wave of contention, where what you can see is that people who are marching in the streets, so these are data from people who were at these protests. So they are protesting. But the question is, what else are they doing? And what I think is really interesting here is they're doing a whole bunch of different types of political or civic activities, including stuff that's really institutional, like contacting an elected official or attending a town hall meeting, right? And I would just like mention here that one of the reasons that we're not seeing more people participating in town hall meetings these days is because many elected officials are refusing to hold town hall meetings. And you can't attend a meeting if your elected representative is not holding them. So it's a little interesting caveat there. I think one of the most notable findings from this, from this slide here is, as you can see, people participating in direct action / civil disobedience has been going up. And so 30% of the people whom we surveyed at No Kings Day 2.0 in Washington, D.C. had participated in civil disobedience or direct action in the past year. And one of the other things that I don't mention here, and I don't have here in the slides, but I think is worth noting, is that we also ask people, this is a question I've been asking since the climate strikes. And in that, we basically ask if people who are in the streets at illegally permitted protests, if they support organizations engaging in civil disobedience. And one of the reasons we asked that question is because I wanted to see if there were patterns to who was supporting and who wasn't supporting civil disobedience. But I'm actually not able to do that kind of analysis, because overwhelmingly at every one of these protests, over 92% of the people in the streets say they support organizations doing civil disobedience. So for those of you who actually engage in civil disobedience and are told by or chided by people saying it's so unpopular, why are you doing, you turn people off to activism. Actually, the people on the left, many of whom are not participating in civil disobedience, are extremely supportive of it. And those are the people who, you don't want to turn off, but they're not being turned off at all. I mean, and we also see this boycotting and boycotting being very prominent here. Note that No King's Day 2 was after the Disney, the efforts to basically send a message to Disney after they canceled Jimmy Kimmel. There's now a big move to push people to cancel their Spotify accounts due to their advertising for ICE. People are using their checkbooks and they're using their, their wallets. It used to be called, grab my wallet. To express their political opinions. So I expect that these things will be quite effective. One of the other things that we ask in the streets is what motivated people to come out in the streets. And they get a list of all the different types of issues that might be motivating them to be out in the streets. And here I think there's something worth noting. Climate change and the environment, which we both together because they're so highly correlated that we don't separate them out as different issues. That's going down. And I think there are a lot of reasons to think about it going down. I mean, still over 50% of the people in the streets, when asked, why are you here? One of the things they say is they're there for climate change. But it's not the top one. I mean, the top one, it makes a lot of sense. The top one, whenever Trump's in the White House, top one tends to be, Trump is a top one. At the same time, we also have immigration has been a very high motivation for, since there had, ICE has started grabbing people off the streets. Also, the federal workforce reduction and funding freeze is a high motivation. But climate change still is up there. And what you can see here is that there is kind of a cluster of motivations that's getting people out in the streets and concerned. So just, finally, just a little summary of the advice that I have. And I was just trying to make this a, relatively quick overview of the work so that then we can have a conversation. But, finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the main findings from my book and how it relates to this moment of polycrisis that we're living in. And so in the book, I end up with three pieces of advice, 3 points that I think everybody should think about as they move forward to think about how they can personally play a role in saving ourselves. So the first one is that we really need to think about creating community and real solidarity. And I say this as, people who care about climate, but also people who care about the autocracy that we're living in and wanting to stop this polycrisis. And, in the book, I talk about the climate movement and the fact that the climate movement historically has tried to become more diverse, but to date, the climate movement does not do a very good job of connecting across identity, orientation, and social class. But it needs to. And if you think back to those demographics that I showed before, the demographics for the people who are out in the streets at No King's Day, consistently we are seeing that No King's Day and the other big protests during this wave of resistance are overwhelmingly white, highly educated, and predominantly, bringing out, Democrats, but not a very diverse group of Democrats. Now, at the moments like now, people of color and people from frontline communities are certainly feeling at risk, so it makes a lot of sense. But there still needs to be ways to build community and solidarity. And so that's one of the things that everybody needs to think about. The second one, which I didn't talk about specifically here in my presentation, but I think it's worth noting, is that folks need to think about capitalizing on moral shocks, including violence. Now, in the book, I distinguish between what I call climate shocks. Now, climate shocks are these climate change exacerbated extreme events, like your hurricanes, your tornadoes, your droughts, your wildfires that are due to drought in many cases, extreme heat, et cetera, and so forth. But there's also moral shocks. And moral shocks is a term that comes from the social science around social movements and talks about how people can actually mobilize and get involved in social movements without actually experiencing or being involved in any social movement organization when they have experience of a moral shock. And a moral shock is when they experience violence, they experience or witness violence against peaceful protesters. And this is what I actually talk about in the book, is that During the period of the civil rights movement, during the period of protest after George Floyd was murdered, people were out in the streets in both of those periods of time because they were shocked by the violence that was perpetrated against either an unarmed black man or peaceful protesters during the civil rights movement. And that actually is a really great way to mobilize people who are sympathizers to the movement to get them involved in the movement. So I think that the movement really needs to think about this and think about how to use the violence that we're seeing and the repression we're seeing, which is really coming from the state, and use that to help to mobilize more people to get out in the streets and participate. And finally, one of the other things that I talk about in the book is, well, I spend a lot of time talking about civil society and then activism, which is one of the main ways that civil society gets involved politically and expresses its voice. But we don't all have to be activists to participate in saving ourselves and to contribute to saving ourselves. What I talk about in the book is that, everybody doesn't need to get arrested. Everybody doesn't need to throw soup or throw food or lock yourself to, an entrance of a building or use crazy glue or even march in the streets if you're not comfortable. But we all have a role to play in the climate crisis, and we all have a role to play in trying to limit the climate crisis. And so in the book, I talk about how we all need to help to cultivate resilience in our communities. And when I talk about cultivating resilience, I'm specifically talking about not just environmental resilience. And environmental resilience would be like getting rid of permeable, make our asphalt more permeable so that there's not as much flooding, or planting, rain gardens or, river birches, et cetera, and so forth to make it less likely to flood, or addressing, ways to make your community less likely to have wildfire breaks if you live in a place where there are wildfires, right? But the other thing, and this is something that we don't think about as much, is about how we make our communities more socially resilient. And that involves creating real relational ties amongst neighbors, amongst people in communities, creating civic groups that can support one another. Because one of the things we know when a climate shock hits is that one of the first things that happens, and I like to tell my students this, is you lose your phone service, right? You lose electricity. So if your entire support system is through your phone, I don't have a phone in my hand, but I usually would hold it up for my students, and you think that you can go on TikTok and get support, it's just not going to happen. Cultivating resilience is about building community support and capacity in your community so that when climate shocks hit, we're able to help and support one another through supporting through food, through mutual aid, through childcare for neighbors, all sorts of things. And we can do that to help support communities when they're dealing with all aspects of the polycrisis. We don't need to just have that for climate shocks, but there are all sorts of shocks where we as communities are better and stronger. And I actually would argue that community resilience and having more resilience in your community can help also with elections and getting people to mobilize and support, candidates who are more pro, addressing the climate crisis, anti, autocracy, et cetera, and so forth. So having a resilient community can be very supportive and helpful in a whole range of ways. And so I think I'm going to end there just because I wanted to try to be brief so that we had a lot of opportunity and time for conversation question. These are the two books that that I was speaking out of for findings. I mean, the newest stuff has not been published anywhere yet. So, actually some of it's come out in the media, but I haven't written anything for articles yet. So stay tuned for those. But I'm happy to now take questions. Should I stop sharing my screen?
Sure. So thanks, Dana. I might ask you to put up that really great slide at the end, towards the end here. But yeah, let's stop sharing for now. And I think some folks have put questions in the chat, which I'll moderate, and then I've got a few of my own. But if you participants want to put more chat questions in here, I'll field them. And there was a technical question about one of your slides, I think from Cindy. Early on, you presented information about the various actions and the demographics. And Cindy was just wanting to know about breakdown of age, because you had race and
oh, I didn't actually mention that. So the age, sorry about that. Yes, thank you for asking that, Cindy. So the Resistance 2.0, like Resistance 1.0, tends to be middle-aged. And actually, Resistance 2.0 so far has been older than Resistance 1.0. The it was a little younger at No King's Day 2, which is it. No King's Day 2, and I'm just looking at my notes here, had a mean age of 46 years old and the median age was 44. 75% of the people in the crowd based on our random sample in Washington, D.C. And of course, this could be different in different cities. But I live in D.C., so we collect our data in D.C. almost exclusively. 25% of the people in the crowd were 60 or older. But 25% of the crowd was 31 or younger, but that's pretty old. Just,
Rogers, yes. Maybe I'll switch to a question from me here. That slide you had towards the end, we had community, moral shocks, and resilience, which is kind of your how-to at the end of the book as well. And on the taking advantage of moral shocks, we have a sort of nascent idea in Scientists Rebellion of trying to capitalize on climate shocks. And we have something called a rapid response team that we're trying to assemble, where we will mobilize quickly around whatever hurricanes and whatnot. But one of the things that you might run into with capitalizing on a moral shock is the feeling that you're exploiting the situation. And I wonder if you've got any thoughts about exploitation of shocks. Check.
Well, so with regard to moral shocks, which tend to be, I mean, the examples that I use in the book are when there was violence against peaceful activists that basically got people out in the streets. Or if we think about, so during the post-George Floyd protests in the summer of 2020, there was that moment where the Trump administration basically tear gassed the folks in Lafayette Square so that Trump could come out and hold up that Bible and do that photo opportunity people may remember. People were almost stampeded. Many people, peaceful protesters were tear gassed. Many members of the media were tear gassed. Or this summer when people were shot with rubber bullets for just standing there, including journalists. Those moments, what happens is when people see them or hear about them, in a lot of cases, it's watching them on TV or seeing them on social media. That's where there's moral shock, where people get upset from having witnessed that and they turn out more. So after all of the events that I just listed, what we saw was that there were more people out in the streets the next day. After that moment at Lafayette Square happened in summer of 2020, you saw a huge turnout of people in the streets of DC marching in support of, ending systemic racism in the United States. We saw Senator Warren come out with her partner and many other elected officials show up. So in that case, I don't think that that's exploitative. It's basically using it to galvanize and get people out. With regard to taking advantage of climate shocks, and basically there are different ways to do it. I mean, one way is to fetishize the people who are the victims of a climate shock, and the other is to work in solidarity with the people who are victims of climate shocks, to use that to help to get the people who are in the communities who might have been climate deniers, who might be conservatives, and just bulk together climate as one of the many issues that they just follow Fox News on. And what I think is really interesting about this is that the research that's come out recently talks about how even people who are ideologically right-leaning, after experiencing the climate crisis firsthand, what you find is that their attitudes towards climate they become much more open to the science and much more supportive of climate action. So taking advantage of that in terms of educating people about what you can do in a community, I don't see that would be exploitative. If you're like, oh, look over there, look at what happened to, Jamaica, and use that to fundraise for a program somewhere else, that could be exploitative. So I think it just has to be really conscientious. And also, I think it should really be connected to the communities that are most affected. And if you do that, then you're just helping to raise their voices and lift those people up.
Yeah, an example might be mutual aid,
Exactly.
pitching in, actually helping on the ground.
Yeah, mucking and gutting rather than just talking about it and then, building something in a different place, for example. Absolutely.
Right. Let's switch here to Shannon asks, how can we enable people to take action via communications, which I think means maybe sort of banding together collectively to do actions through communications channels. And what are your thoughts
So like
there?
basically online, is that what she's talking about?
I think so. I'm not completely sure what Shannon meant there, but
Can I
Well,
clarify?
sure.
Okay. I
Hi,
meant,
Shannon. We're connected online. I know you.
yeah, you do. And I used one of your papers in my book. Um, I was asking, so one thing I'm really interested in is using communications to help enable people to take collective action. So in terms of things like messaging, and like you were just talking about, people who have been affected by climate shocks, well, maybe one way to is to point out how people have been affected by climate and are being affected even when they don't realize it. So any other things, I'm especially interested in providing advice to like community organizers who want to communicate to folks to recruit them, but don't know what they should talk about and not just have a table and be like, you should sign up for us.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I think providing information and talking about how to understand it and how to understand the effects of it. For example, there was just a study that is getting a lot of attention today that just came out about how many people have died due to extreme heat, which is a climate shock, but is a lesser studied climate shock because it's like pernicious, right? And it's very hard to study. And I've been talking with some folks about trying to think about it because everybody experiences heat waves. And actually when heat waves hit, we know that as climate change makes heat waves hotter, more people are actually dying. So this was a study that just came out like trying to calculate that. And so people will hear about that and it kind of seems, fantastical, whatever, but communicating the findings and how there are lessons for communities about that. For example, anywhere in the continental United States certainly experiences heat waves, although they experience it differently depending on if you're, more south in our country versus, up in Maine. But thinking about the effects of that and what you can then like thinking about in terms of communicating, one, this is what the science is saying. Two, this is what it means for our community. And there are some really great resources for that around, like particularly Climate Central has some great stuff on their website for taking like the information in the scientific papers and data and applying it and mapping out what it means for your community. And then three, what can we do about it? Well, instead of just signing somebody up, put together like a phone tree for supporting people when there's a heat wave, particularly like elderly people and people who might be limited in their mobility. So they might need to be checked on so that we make sure they have water. If they don't have air conditioning, be able to take them to a cooling station. I mean, there's just stuff like that can be a really great way to start to communicate. I mean, the other thing that I'm really interested in is thinking about how we can use libraries to help to diffuse and share information about climate change and understanding what climate work is all about. That is like the ways that we respond to and recover from disaster that's climate exacerbated, the way we build resilience, and the ways we also can reduce carbon consumption, because we need to do all four. I hope that answers your question, Shannon.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Shannon, for clarifying it. Thank you. Then a couple of methodological questions are coming up from Sammy and Melinda. I think one of them is there's a definition for direct action in one of your slides where the percentages are relatively high, and the question is, how do you define direct action? Is that just protests and marches, or like what's the definition?
No, direct action is defined as civil disobedience.
Okay, actual civil disobedience.
Yeah.
And then we also have a question about extrapolating your mostly DC-based results to the rest of the country.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And let me tell you a couple things about that. I mean, first of all, historically, I collect data. I mean, I used to be at Columbia University, so I collected all my data in New York because I was there. Now I'm here in DC. It's convenient for me, although these days not as pleasantly convenient, because historically people used to march on DC, right? And so protests, even through the first Trump administration, like the big flagship protests would be in DC, so people would come here. However, I have gone through periods where with resources that I was able to get, like I had a grant from the Russell Sage Foundation where we collected data after George Floyd was murdered in DC, New York, Chicago, and LA, with the idea being that we could then compare across different cities. Because you're completely right that the DC is unique in many ways. That was really challenging to do, and it takes a lot of resources to do it. I worked with Indivisible for the first No Kings Day, where we actually collected data from across the country. And one of the things that I should just say is the resistance this time around is much more geographically distributed, right? It's not just a couple of places where they're telling everybody to go, but rather they're asking people to mobilize and protest and take action in their communities, which I think is so much better because it also means that it then can connect the people who come out to actual organizations working within those communities rather than, like I talk about in American Resistance, in the first wave of resistance to Trump, like after the first Women's March, people organize these groups and hubs on buses going back to communities. But a lot of times people got involved in these national groups and there was no connection to their communities where they were living, which meant that they could do distributed organizing, which is kind of connected through digital means, but there was not the tangible connection to community. And I think that's absolutely necessary for politics. It's absolutely necessary for climate action, for us to do the work in our communities. So I just kind of like lost my train of thought here a little bit. But basically, I would just say that so when I collected data at No King's Day 1, where we collected data in Philadelphia because there was no protest here in DC because there was a military parade. You may have seen pictures of it. I also worked with Indivisible to collect data across the country. And what we found was there was a lot of consistency across the country in terms of the demographics, in terms of the issues that were mobilizing and motivating people to turn out in the streets. So I would just say that that's the case. But it is true that like if I were, in a perfect world, I would have teams doing this all over the place. But, I'm one person. I have no funding to do this work. So we have like a little bit of funding from my provost, from my center that I'm able to allocate for it. But I figure it's a good thing that I'm in DC because, if I were at a university somewhere, at least it's somewhat defensible. But yeah, absolutely, that's a limitation.
Yeah. Yeah, no funding. That's carry out the work. That's familiar to us.
Yep,
on,
yep.
Well,
Labors
speaking
of love, right?
yeah. We have another question in here that's kind of related or poked by the demographic results here. And Adam, I'll boil it down, but Adam basically asks, given that white Americans and white Democrats are starting to feel maybe for the first time the kind of oppression and repression that other groups have historically felt, how can we sort of use that moment to center anti-colonial and anti-fascist struggles of other peoples in that predominantly white community?
That's a wonderful question, and that's a hard question. I think my first response would be that it would be great. One response is about building solidarity, but it is true, like in predominantly white spaces, bringing in people of color to talk about colonialism sometimes doesn't work really well. At the same time, I do know that one of the most amazing moments of protest in US history that I lived through, I didn't live through the civil rights movement, was after George Floyd was murdered. And I remember all of these people who were scholars who like I had followed and learned from when I was doing my Ph.D. reached out to me and they said, Dana, why are there so many white people in the streets? Because during the civil rights movement, it was predominantly Black people in the streets. And one of the things that was so interesting was to see how racial justice was really like people identified with the call and with the experience of George Floyd. And we saw solidarity. And I wrote a paper about the intersectionality of that moment for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that everybody's interested in, because it was really interesting. And the question is, could we see that now? And right now, it's very hard to think about that because so many people of color are feeling really concerned about getting out in the streets. And I have to say that having been out in the streets surveying people, in many cases, people of color, even if they do get sampled, they do not want to participate in our survey, even though it is completely anonymous. And they do it on my tablet, so I can't track you. There's no way for me to figure out who you are, but they still are just uncomfortable with it. So we may see somewhat underestimation. I mean, I have to say at No King's Day 2, many people did not want to be surveyed. It was the lowest response rate I've ever had at a survey or at a protest, because so many people were just like, I didn't bring my phone and I do not want to be counted in any way, but I'm here. And I completely get that. But I mean, I realized that was not really the question. In terms of thinking about how to take this moment, I think that I think one thing that would be really valuable is to think about how to tell stories that draw the connections between the ways that people are starting to feel threatened in white America to other peoples who have felt repressed and threatened historically, and particularly towards our colonial roots in history. Um, I don't know how to do that. I mean, I know that there are scholars who are working on that kind of work, but I think that taking the time to think about it, I think is really valuable and worthwhile. And I think the best way to do it is through the organizations that are coordinating some of these actions and protests in your community, be it, through, Scientist Rebellion, or through Indivisible, or through, um, ACLU has been really involved. I mean, there's so many different groups. I know Third Act has been doing a lot of work around this too. So working through organizations so that they can maybe provide resources and do that kind of communication that Shannon had asked about.
Yeah, and perhaps for the Buen Vivir series, we ought to reach out to some of those groups and see if we can get some folks to come and speak directly to their experience. Maybe
idea.
turning a little bit towards Scientist Rebellion, we have a question from Scientist Rebellion member Paul here, who asks, how do we mobilize academics and scientists against fossil fuel interests and sort of climate bad actors when they're actually fearful of repercussions? And this is a big problem for even people joining Scientist Rebellion. They're a little bit afraid to be seen as someone who's standing against their potential funders. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because I've done these conversations in the past, and at American, I tried very hard to get my I wanted to have everybody who was affiliated with my center to take a fossil-free pledge, right? So they would basically no longer take fossil fuel money. And all of a sudden, I ended up talking with one of the chemists involved in our center, and he said, every startup package in chemistry at our university is subsidized by the petrochemical industry. And so I was told, if I wanted to kill my having arrived and having goodwill amongst the faculty, I could lose all the scientists that way. So I took a step back and decided what we would do is basically I would ask people to commit personally, but not make a blanket statement, because basically people would no longer want to have anything to do with me. But I think what's interesting in this moment, so that was something that I learned 2 years ago, which I had no idea about. But what I feel like is interesting in this moment is that so many of us have lost our funding that I actually think it might be a moment where people feel more comfortable thinking about making statements and using being more political in their research. Because I mean, it's also that I think fossil fuel interests have become so obviously evil. I mean, it's very hard for anybody not to see that. So you either just don't care about how evil they are, or you recognize it and maybe looking for a way to do something about it. I mean, I think that, the further down the climate crisis we get, I mean, and I think it's going to become even more apparent as we see all of the crazy stuff that fossil fuel interests are trying to pull off at COP30 and in preparation for COP30. So I think it might be a good opportunity to do that. And I always find that calling people out and highlighting, one, the way that elected officials take fossil fuel money, which, happens on the left and the right, even though we only really tend to talk about it on the left. On the right. So, I mean, we really need to focus on all the people on the left who are taking the money, but also fossil fuel subsidies and the way that fossil fuel companies basically are being able to function and make money off of us and our resources that they're not paying a fair price for, and they're not paying a fair price to clean up the mess when they make it. So using that, I think, helps, and it may be helpful for thinking about mobilizing students, but also scientists.
Yeah, it's
I mean,
interesting to hear you talk about the experience you had because we ran a similar thing with trying to get individuals to sign up for fossil fuel pledges to not take money. And it was actually quite difficult to get lots of people to sign up. They were quite reluctant. What were you going to say?
well, I was going to say two things. I was going to say one is go to the social scientists because we never, I mean, fossil fuel companies don't tend to support us. So it's a lot easier to go to social scientists. And once you get a critical mass, it's a lot easier. That would be my guess if you get more scientists.
Hmm.
But then I was also going to say that, in addition to so many people having lost funding, since so many, I mean, like so many of us, like everything I do is basically banned now. I mean, when there were those lists going around of all the banned words, I think that every title of every paper I've written in the past 15 years has one of those words in it.
Hmm.
So I was like, well, if I'm going to be banned anyway, so I think a lot of people may be feeling that way where they may as well take a stand because once you've lost all your funding, what else do you have to lose? You may as well stand up. So
Yeah,
it's
there's
worth
nothing left to
trying.
lose, school of thought.
Exactly.
Right. Let's see. So Aquavita asks, well, given that the media has basically is capitulating in the process of capitulating to the government, how are we going to get folks to communicate the nature of the polycrisis and like how can we get them personally to start acting and communicating about it if we can't depend on the media? I think is the question.
Yeah, huge problem. I mean, I actually at the No King's Day protest, we actually started looking at media diets of the people who are in the streets because one of the things that I want to start thinking about is how do we understand the different silos within society and how they may be associated with people's perspectives on climate change. Um, But we do have a problem because even, kind of the standard mainstream media that we thought were at least going to not capitulate, well, they're capitulating and they're also, biasing the way they're reporting on the, destruction over at the White House in terms of tearing down the White House, along with, talking less and less about climate change or not talking about the connections between extreme events and climate change, et cetera, and so forth. So what do we do about it? Well, I mean, I think that one thing that we could think about is how do we build better communication channels and communication, make the connections to individual and, alternative communication providers and support them. I mean, I know there are a number of outlets that do really good work like GRIST or Inside Climate and giving more support to them and helping to lift up them as legitimate mainstream channels for information. But I think it's a huge problem, and I don't really have an answer for it, except for to say that like the first thing we need to do is recognize the problem, and then we need to figure it out. I mean, I know there's a bunch of people on the left who are like, what we really need is our Joe Rogan, and if we had our Joe Rogan, everything would be okay. I do not know that that is the best solution here because it just is going to fragment society even more. And so it could be a band-aid if you found that Joe Rogan for the moment, if they would be, have a good perspective on understanding fossil fuel interests and the ways that they have captured, decision making and power in our country. But that I just think that's dangerous. So
Mm.
yeah, so I think we need to think really carefully about it, but I think we do need to look at ways to create and support opportunities for more local news, even though there's so little funding for that. And yeah.
Yeah. That kind of verges on a question I have and a related one from Bill about your term anthro shift because you mostly define it, I think, as based on a perception of or an evaluation of risk. And that's what Bill points out in the chat. But I think in one of your slides, you said misinformation is a problem. And I know that humans are terrible at assessing risk. And so in this information environment that we're soaking in, can we actually get to a place where a significant number of people have correctly assessed the risk that would lead them to a good answer shift?
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny. I took out this slide on anthrop shift because I was worried I was not going to have enough time. So I think I should have kept it in. So the anthrop shift is basically so we understand society to be made up of the state, the market, and the civil society sectors, and the way that they interact with one another determines kind of political outcomes around all sorts of things. So the theory of the anther shift, which is a theory that Andrew Jorgensen and I came up with a couple of years ago, talks about what it takes to shift power amongst the state, the market, and civil society. And we talk about the role that risk plays in pivoting this orientation between these different actors. And I have a piece called Anther Shift in a Warming World, which came out of Nature Climate Action a couple of years ago, where I basically use the anther shift to understand climate change. And that actually is kind of, I use that and build off of that in the book in a way that's really, hopefully really accessible. But so the things that I think are worth noting here is like a great example of an anther shift is if we think about during the pandemic. There was this, everybody started out by being like, oh, I hear there's this disease coming out of China. Oh, I hear there's stuff going on in Europe and people are getting afraid. Oh, I hear, and all these rumors, right? And everybody, there was just these like the information was coming. And then at a certain point, people felt so afraid for their, everybody felt afraid about everybody originally, or they were afraid because they thought that, people in their families who were, who were at risk would be, could be harmed by it. And all of a sudden, the whole world changed because we experienced this anther shift where basically, in this case, actually the state locked everybody down. And that was driven by this risk. It was driven not by people actually getting sick, but rather by people feeling like they could get sick. But the other component of the anther shift is actually what I call multi-directionality, which is that things can change, but then they can change back again. And that's one of the reasons that I know that the climate crisis needs to get quite bad before we actually make the kinds of changes that are needed, because they're not easy changes, as everybody here knows. But going to this question of risk perception, which is what you asked, Greg, it's a real challenge. I mean, this misinformation part, when we wrote the theory of the anther shift, we didn't realize how successful misinformation would be. I mean, and it was well before Hurricanes Helene or the wildfires where we saw like people saying, oh yeah, Biden caused Hurricane Helene and FEMA is evil, and kicking FEMA out of communities where they were trying to help them to respond and recover, right? What I've been trying to do since is trying to understand how this misinformation is getting into communities and getting into individuals, with the hope that if we do that, we can figure out how to stop those channels and to inoculate people against. I mean, certainly one of the things is about education and the ways that fossil fuel interests and those who are beholden to them have basically permeated it into schools and trained our children to question the science of climate change. I mean, it's happening all over the country, all sorts of right-leaning misinformation has gotten into schools and has really made it so a lot of young people don't learn about all sorts of issues that we might care about. And so we have to figure out how to fix that and how to address that when we come into contact with people who are not understanding the risk. I mean, a great example of that is people who live in areas that have become, flood risk zones, or are at risk for extreme events and don't even realize it or can't even get insurance and are like, oh no, it's fine, because they don't realize the risk. The theory of the anther shift says that at a certain point, they are going to feel the risk because they're going to see the sea level rising, or they're going to flood, or there's going to be a wildfire and they're going to have to move, or else, their house is going to burn down. So that is like the material reality of the climate crisis, but we do not want it to get that far where so many people have to die before action is taken. And that's why we need to think about how to mobilize the masses faster and think about how to do that. I mean, the misinformation one is one of the big things that I'm trying to start to address now in my research, because I just don't know. And I don't think enough people have recognized how important it is in terms of kind of the ways that media has been captured and the ways that so many people solely get their information from Fox or other right-leaning media outlets that are, well, let's say diluting the truth. I'm trying to think of a nice way to say that. And there was a really interesting study that came out in March from Pew, and I actually am using their question in my surveys. and it asks people about their media diets. And you actually can go on Pew's website and you basically can select people based on their political affiliation, their age. Um, there's one other characteristic. And you basically, if you can select like everybody who's 50 and older, right? You can select, it's not 50 and older, I think it's like 60 and older, 65 and older. You select that and it'll basically show you the distribution of media outlets that people say that they get their news from, or Republicans or independents or Democrats. And it's so interesting because it's so fractured now that it makes us completely ripe and open to misinformation when that's happening. And so how to fix it, that's the next question. But it's definitely something we should all be thinking about.
Right. And a sort of underlying principle of scientists' rebellion, which maybe is untested, is that if we can get the right information to people, that actually will drive their behavior. It's not clear to me now that that's the case. But
Well, I would just say, I mean, when I was doing my PhD was on the Kyoto Protocol, which is ancient history. And so the book that came out of it was called National Governance in the Global Climate Change Regime. And I had a really important conversation with Bob Watson, who used to run the IPCC back when I was doing my work on my dissertation. And he said to me, which I quoted in my book, and since then it has come and, I've been hit in the head with this quote many, many times over my career. He said to me, science is necessary but insufficient for action. And the thing is that, I think that what we need to do is figure out how to teach people what to do with the science. And so that's the missing piece. I mean, that's one of the things that I think that social scientists and educators can really help with. But that's what we need to figure out is once the science is there, how do you get people to go from hearing the science to believing the science? And how do you get them from believing the science to acting on the science? So it's multiple steps, right? Maybe it's like a ladder of knowledge or something. I don't know. But so that's something we really need to think about.
An epistemological ladder or something like this.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to finish out Bill's question here. I wasn't fair to his question because he also asked about anthro shifts and whether they're driven just by risk or are there other things like your relationship to others, herd behavior, other kinds of drivers besides an assessment of risk to anthro shift.
Well, so an anthro shift it's society wide is where an anthro shift takes place. So it's not individual level. So it's basically the driver of it is perceptions of risk at the society level. And then if you wanted to think about like when we think about risk perception and risk behavior, that is a really individual. And then certainly thinking about social networks and other characteristics of individuals may determine their risk, but it's more thinking about getting over a certain threshold of risk perception at a society level that then leads to these types of societal changes.
I see. Let's see, we're sort of approaching the end of the hour here, but Jennifer asks a pointed question related to us, Scientists Rebellion. What do you think the best way is that we can show up as scientists in this moment?
Well, I mean, so I've been thinking a lot about how climate change has gone down as a priority for many people who have been out in the streets. And thinking about what that means for people who want to mobilize and address the climate crisis. And I think the lesson from my thinking about that might be helpful for Scientist Rebellion. And what I would say is I think that it's really about solidarity and turning out and supporting people who are feeling all sorts of aspects of the polycrisis. So I think Scientist Rebellion, the first of all, being reactionary and prepared to react when people experience climate shocks is absolutely valuable. And I think that's a great idea. And preparing, having a toolbox at the ready for how you actually help people connect those dots could be wonderful. At the same time, I also think thinking about how to expand the conversation so that we can talk about climate change and the climate crisis within the current moment of polycrisis and being able to help to talk to other people who are experiencing other aspects of the polycrisis and help them think about it. I mean, we know climate change is a threat multiplier, right? I mean, everybody here knows that, but the general public may not know that. So, having those kinds of conversations with organizations and others who are working on other aspects of the poly crisis and trying to figure out how to work together on common issues where you're coming from different perspectives on it in terms of the issue that's motivating you to get there, but you still care about these other issues. I think that could be a really good way of thinking about it.
Mm.
But I don't
Yeah.
think that trying to get people to be like one issue activists makes sense right now, because there's just too much, right? We have to think about this as many flowers bloom, and think about this as, intersectional and solidarity driven.
Yeah, I agree. That's perhaps a good place to end here, respecting folks' time. And thank you so much, Dana. Really appreciate the conversation. I'm glad you made space actually for everyone's questions. That was fantastic. So again, thank you so much. I will just add here that next month, of course, we continue on November 19th with our next Buen Vivir. That's going to be by Max Wilbert, and he runs the newsletter Biocentric and is the author of Bright Green Lies, How the Environmental Movement Lost Its Way and What We Can Do About it. So thanks, everybody. Send your emojis of support here, and thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
Thank you, Dana. Cheers all.